Cherubini's an interesting guy because he was born in Italy, showed quite a bit of promise, like most, eventually famous, people showed a lot of promise, and was writing operas actually quite early in his life. Wound up traveling different places to study, and wound up settling finally in Paris. And that was a good move for him. He got to Paris by the time he was about 30, I think, somewhere in that vicinity, and had established himself as an opera composer, and fit right in actually with the opera scene in the 1790s, and was quite successful for a while. But about early 1800s, the style shifted. We moved from the sort of Mozart orientation to the Beethoven orientation, and at least as far as opera goes, Cherubini had a little trouble making that transition.
He wasn't into that newfangled
stuff. However, he did some other things. He wrote some instrumental music, certainly, and some chamber music. There's actually a famous French horn piece that we play. But what he hit on about 1805, before 1810, was writing sacred music. Tried his hand at that. And apparently, perhaps it was the sort of combination of the traditional orientation of his composition with experience in dramatic writing, probably made a nice combination for sacred music. And he really was quite successful after that.
That's right. And speaking of combination, I think his lifespan is an interesting combination, which you already alluded to, but we often, as musicians and musicologists, divide music into periods of history. And there's definitely the classical period, which was Mozart and Haydn, and then there's the Romantic period, of which Beethoven was the catalyst. He started in the classical period, but then was, essentially the catalyst for the Romantic period. But Cherubini lived throughout the lifetime of Mozart and Beethoven.
Right.
And I think for that time lived a relatively long life.
Yeah, 1760 to 1842 is a pretty healthy lifespan. That's 80 some years.
Even by today's
pretty good. That's right. That's pretty good. So anyway, he wrote 2 requiems in his life. This one, which is his first requiem that we're going to play. The second requiem is sort of entertaining. He wrote it about 6 years or so before he died, and he wrote it for himself. He wrote it just the requiem master at his own funeral, which is, depending on how you look at it, it's either charming or quite conceited or morbid, right? But this, as you say, this first requiem really made a big splash.
It did, and it's unique in a couple of ways. One, it has no soloists.
Right, that is definitely unique.
Right, it's for the orchestra and the chorus. We'll be joined by the wonderful Yakima Symphony chorus, but no, soprano or tenor or any vocal soloists, which is unique. But at that time, it was not really acceptable to use female voices in the chorus.
That's right, still even at that.
That's right, and that's why he wrote the second requiem for his own funeral, because there were issues. Some people criticized the first one, and he wanted to make sure that a requiem of his was played at his funeral, so he had to write a second one only for male voices, and that's why the second one exists.
Well, you learn something every day, don't you? The piece itself is quite dramatic, and it's something that I can't help it as a student of this period of history. I'm fascinated by how much of it sort of sounds like Mozart, and then how much of it sounds like Beethoven, and somehow it sort of all mixes together, because it really does have some wonderful dramatic moments.
It does.
We've talked about what my favorite is, but why don't you tell me?
Well, I think it's interesting to compare it to the Verdi Requiem, which is also on our concert season.
Another opera composer, right?
That's right. Verdi is the great opera composer, and many people call his Requiem basically an opera without staging, without costumes. And we'll be doing that on our final concert of the season. And you know, a requiem is simply a musical setting of a set text.
Right.
So basically, with a few minor alterations, all requiems, but in particular these two, the Cherubini and the Verdi Requiem, are different musical settings of the same words.
Right.
And I would encourage our viewers and listeners to, of course, come to both concerts, but to really, you know, compare and contrast and see what they hear as the differences. You know, one major difference, just to point out one thing to listen for, is the Dies Irae movement, which is in the Requiem Mass is actually several sections.
Right.
And
it's the longest,
it's the biggest chunk of the Mass.
Yeah,
right.
Right.
And various composers treat it in different ways. Verdi actually has a separate movement for each of the sections of the Dies Irae. And that alone makes the Verdi Requiem almost 84 minutes. I mean, it's 84
Right.
minutes long, and that one section is about 40 minutes.
Well, but that makes sense because the Dies Irae section is all about the day of wrath, the day of judgment, and all the horrible things that are going to happen, or the good things if you're, you know, judged favorably.
Right.
But there's all kinds of events that take place on that day, and so they all have to be spelled out.
That's right.
And so as a result, there are two things. First of all, it's likely to be the most dramatic because it's all about, you know, if you're bad, this is your punishment, and if that sort of thing. But it would also lend itself beautifully to a composer who was sort of operatically inclined. I mean, that would be the meat of the entire thing, because the rest of it is all about having mercy and, you know, on the souls and eternal peace and that sort of thing, which in themselves are pretty, you know, desirable things, but they don't pack the same dramatic, you know, variety or
Why
something.
don't you
like
tell them about your favorite part of the
Well, my
Cherubini?
favorite part. Well, it's a lot like Verdi in a way, because my favorite part of that is also the Dies Irae. But it's when at the beginning of the Dies Irae, which is preceded by this nice sort of fading out, very gentle kind of section about, you know, having mercy and so forth. And then all of a sudden, there's this loud brass fanfare with this huge cymbal tam-tam crash, right? A gong.
Right.
And it's quite hilarious in a way, because it's almost sort of cheesy dramatic, you know. And then the tam-tam player goes over and sits down. They're done for the evening, you know.
He plays one note
the whole
piece.
time.
You know, and so going back to the comparison with Cherubini with the Verdi, first of all, I'll just mention that the Dies Irae in Cherubini is one movement. So he didn't choose to separate it like Verdi did, but it's one continuous movement. But on the similarity side, Verdi also features a percussion instrument very prominently, and it's not the tam-tam as Cherubini does, it's the bass drum.
The bass drum, right.
And it's probably, almost undoubtedly, the most famous bass drum part in the repertoire.
It definitely is. Well, it's going to be a very interesting concert, and I think one that reflects the Dia de los Muertos, I think, in sort of all the right ways. We've got reminiscence, we've got celebration, we've got days of judgment.
The Mexican connection.
Yeah, and hopefully some mercy and so forth. Anyway, thanks for joining us. Saturday, October 30th at 7:30 p.m. in the Seasons Performance Hall, the Yakima Symphony Orchestra and its Dia de los Muertos performance.